On April 14th, America watched with pride and excitement as another milestone was reached in our attempts to soar beyond our planet and discover more about the universe around us. The spaceship Columbia made the first successful standard landing of any craft returning from space. One South Dakotan was especially interested and intrigued. He remembers the news of man's first successful powered flight in 1903 at Kitty Hawk. Clyde Ice, 92 years young, is South Dakota's premier aviation pioneer. He began flying in 1919 in a plane he traded a North Dakota man 2 used cars for. Clyde has always been a visionary. He suspected in the 1920s and 30s that the space fiction he enjoyed reading about in newspaper comics might not be that far-fetched.
I used to see those funny papers when we'd be sitting out of wind or a bad day, and I told them many a time that we might see all that, which we are right now.
Did people think you were maybe
Oh, they thought you was crazy. But you better not ever say they can't do anything, because the first time you turn around, they'll be liable to be doing it.
Yeah. Did you ever have any desire to, once you, in the 60s, say, when you were still flying and you were, at that time, quite along in years, did you ever have a desire that you'd like to fly in something like the Columbia to go around the Earth that way?
Well, I never really had any special desire for it.
When you got started flying, I think you said you started in 1919 as a pilot. What got you interested in flying? What was the big thing there?
Well, when the pilots first began to come back from the war, they brought back some of the old surplus airplanes, Jennies and Standards, and guy come to the little town where I lived and wanted somebody to help him round up passengers. He was hopping passengers.
Where was that at?
That was over, well, I was at St. Lawrence right then. And I got a ride or two with him, and I kind of got the fever, and I thought that's the thing I ought to be doing.
So did you take lessons from him, or did you just learn on your own, or?
No, I never had any lessons. I heard about an airplane up in North Dakota that some farmer had won, selling subscriptions for the St. Paul Dispatch. And they flew it up there and set it down in his pasture and left it. And he never didn't know enough to tie it down or anything, and the wind blew it over. And I heard about it, and I was selling automobiles at the time, and I went up to see him, and I talked him into taking a couple of used cars I had that was worth about $400 a piece, and for the airplane. And I got a friend of mine, that one of the ones I'd been selling tickets for, to come up and fly it down to where I wanted it. He landed at Redfield, and he had arrangements for taking 4 guys to Aberdeen to a baseball game. And he put 2 of them, I'd had about a half a dozen rides then, and he put 2 of them in this airplane, and nobody in the world could ever get it off the ground with that kind of a load and the power I had, and said, take him to Aberdeen. Well, I tried to talk him, I got him off the side. They were sitting there in the airplane. And I said, well, you know, I can't take those guys to Aberdeen. I never flew an airplane in my life. Well, he said, if you don't need the money, don't take them. So I got in there and taxied down through the field a couple of times and finally rolled a tire off. What he figured was that I'd run into fence down there, because he knew enough about airplanes to know that I couldn't get off with them in that soft stubble field. Couldn't even get the tail off the ground. And I run down there towards the fence and seen the fence coming up, and I shut the motor off. Well, I had done that twice, and the second time I turned around a little too fast and rolled a tire off. So I told these guys that there was no chance to take them. They were mad because I couldn't take them. It was too late to get there with a car for this ball game. And they were just madder than the dickens. And he went on, took two. He had a bigger airplane or more power. And he got his two off. I had notion to tell these guys I'd never flown an airplane, and when they got mad. Anyway, he went on, and they went on, tried to drive up. And he came back, and I was so tired from working day and night fixing that airplane up that I just crawled under the wing and went to sleep. Didn't fix the tire. It was Sunday, and we had to have a inner tube. So when he got back, he went uptown and got an inner tube and fixed the wheel and took off. And I sat there till pretty near sundown, and I got to thinking, well, I might just well try to take off. And I taxied down through that field, and being alone, well, before I knew it, I was off the ground. And I flew it on till the sun went down, and it was getting dark, and I remembered that they'd put up a bunch of haystacks in the field where we were going to land, where we'd been landing and hauling passengers out of Miller. So I landed, I flew over this big stubble field or cornfield alongside of it, and I figured if I flew real low and gradually shut the motor off, wheels would settle onto the ground. And it worked. So I tied it down, and next morning he came out and took it into Miller. The wind was blowing again the next day. Well, we had two airplanes and one pilot. And he wasn't too hot. He didn't know too much more about them than I did, but he'd been flying a little. So I was going to sell tickets and take one in mine and one in his, change off and split what we made. And a little guy came out there, I can see him yet, about 5'4", and he wanted to know if we was taking people for rides, and I said, sure. And this guy had gone to town for coffee. We was right in the edge of town. And I got this guy all rigged up with a helmet and goggles and got him in and had the wheels blocked and kept stalling around. It was a turn for my airplane, so I was supposed to have that passenger, but he didn't come back, and I got to worrying that guy he'd get uneasy and want to get out. So I got to thinking, well, I just might as well take him myself. So I told him not to touch that little lever on the side, the throttle. And I went around and took the blocks out. I got the motor started and took the blocks out and got in, and I took him for a ride for a $5 bill, my second solo flight.
You didn't tell him it was only your second flight, though?
No, I didn't tell him until about 15 years afterwards I met him. He asked me if I remembered. And I told him then that I'd never flown an airplane but once before.
You showed me a picture before we started of you hanging upside down from the bottom of an airplane in the barnstorming days and acrobatics. I'm surprised you survived to be as old as you are, because I've heard read of a lot of horror stories of barnstorming and acrobatics that didn't quite work out right. People got killed very easily doing that. How did you get involved with the acrobatics and the barnstorming and things like that?
Well, the reason, usually they wanted you to put on some kind of a little show, county fair or old settlers picnic or whatever you went to. And that time, when I done it the first time, and when several parachute jumps I made, couldn't find anybody to do it. So I had somebody else to fly, and I done the rope ladder and parachute jumps and sitting on top of the wing while they stunted and stuff like that.
Was that rather nerve-wracking the first couple times you did it, or were you young and enthusiastic?
No, I kind of enjoyed it.
You kind of enjoyed it?
Yeah.
What, in the barnstorming days then, that was before there was a lot of the Civil Air Patrol or for the Federal Aviation Administration got into it.
You were on your own. There wasn't any regulations of any kind. I tried to I've seen so many guys crack up doing acrobatics with those old rubber wing airplanes that weren't built for that. And I saw several of them get killed and kill several people. And I tried to get a bill passed through PIR. I got it through the House to eliminate acrobatics with that kind of airplane. I never got it through. But that was in the early days. That was the first time anybody tried to get any regulations in this part of the country.
Did you ever have any crack-ups, whether it was doing acrobatics or just barnstorming or spraying or anything?
No.
You never had an accident the whole time?
I knocked a wheel off one time when I was chasing horses. And the motor quit, and I was down in the canyon. And I bent up the propeller and knocked the wheel off on a big rock. There wasn't any place to land that was decent to land, and I landed down in the bottom of that canyon, and I hit a rock. That's the closest I ever come to wrecking an airplane.
When did you decide to get into commercial airline service or commercial service of any kind, whether it was spraying or how did you lead into that from the barnstorming and things like that?
Well, I went to Rapid City and a couple of guys came out and wanted to know if I'd like to go in with them and form a corporation, and that was in 1921. And we organized what we called Rapid Airlines. And I was showing a guy how to do loops and acrobatics in a standard, and the fuselage broke in two, and we just come down on two wires and a prayer. All that held it together was the control wires that went from the stick out to the ailerons. But we got on the ground without any trouble, taxied up to a haystack, and I decided that if I was going to grow long white whiskers, I better get out of those old wooden airplanes. Covering came off of the fuselage, and when we was upside down, and dirt come up in our face from dust that had collected all summer. But it finally turned over, and I got it straightened up and made the prettiest landing ever made. I taxied up to a haystack, and that's the last time I flew any of those wooden ones. I had 2 or 3 airplanes then, and we put them away for parts and went to Denver and bought an Eagle Rock metal job, the first one. And we sold a bunch of airplanes, and then later, when I got the idea for a Ford Trimotor, went to Detroit and worked on that while they were building it, took it out.
How do you mean you worked on it while they were building it? I mean,
Worked
you were
on
physically...
the factory.
Oh, you did?
I drove rivets from one end of that airplane to the other. Took 3 months from the time we went down there till they turned it over to me. I went down there the 1st of March and went to work in the factory, and they turned it over to me on my birthday, the 28th of May. And I went to Buffalo, New York, and started barnstorming with the Ford. I barnstormed all over the country. I done the first night flying in half the big cities of the United States. I never got west of the mountains, but I flew from New York to New Orleans and from the East Coast to the mountains, Denver and Colorado Springs, and we had that thing all over the country. I was the first, I'm sure I'm the first pilot to carry 500 people in a day. I carried 510 people at Buffalo from 9 o'clock in the morning till 12:30 at night.
Was that a pretty lucrative business at the time? Did you make a lot of money off of it?
We sent home $13,500 the first 10 days out of the factory after paying the airport 15% and paying for our gas and hotel bills and ticket salesmen. I sent home $138,000 in 17 months out of the factory.
Jeez, you must have, is that how you got started in your other parts of your flying business? Or?
Well, they spread that out so thin and tried to get so big that we just kind of finally went broke. During the Dust Bowl days, we got to carrying people for a penny a pound. I carried 750 one afternoon in Texas without shutting the motors off for a penny a pound.
Uh-huh.
We had 2 corrals built with ropes and a set of scales there, and I only gave them just little rides. When I was at Buffalo, I was giving them from 10 to 15-minute rides. But down there, we were giving them those penny a pound rides, and we had a big field where I could land and taxi up to these rope corrals and unload the load I had, and they'd move the ropes over and run the other, just like loading sheep out here in a ranch. And they'd run another load in, and I'd take off, and as soon as I was high enough to clear the 4-wire fence there with the end of the wing, I'd bend it around, go right around that 600-acre field and come back and land, just round and round. Never shut the motors off, and we carried 750 people.
When the war came along, the Second War, in 1941, did that put any restrictions or on what you were allowed to do flying-wise? Did the Army need more planes, so they were asking for civilian planes, or what?
This airport over here and one in Missouri are the only ones that wasn't closed when they hit Pearl Harbor.
Why?
The only reason for that, I had a training program then, a CPT, Civilian Pilot Training Program over here. And the only reason that this and that one in Missouri wasn't closed, the inspectors happened to be there. There was one here. He got a dozen telegrams that day from Washington about condition, what was going on and what to do. But every other airport in the United States was closed for about 3 days, except Spearfish and that one in Missouri.
Was it after the war or during the war that most of the federal regulations came into play?
Oh, they just gradually kept building them up. They're still thinking of silly things to do. Yeah, they get some of the doggone. For instance, they started out at one time, a guy had to have 10 hours instrument in his logbook. Well, when they gave him a license, it showed that he had instrument training. Well, 10 hours isn't enough to find out how little you know about instrument flight. They just give them a legal way to commit suicide. 10 hours on instrument training, and they finally changed that. But that was, I said, as soon as I heard that, it was the most foolish thing I ever heard of. And it was.
Did you yourself have to go to flight schools, or did you just continually, you mentioned when you first started, you just taught yourself, but as you came flying more and more sophisticated airplanes and maybe dealing with more people and flying, you know, from 2 to 18 people, did you have to go to flight schools and learn about the new equipment?
When they gave me this flight training program, they sent a guy out here from Washington to check me out. And we went to Rapid City to fly down there to another airport. Coming back, he was going to show me how to spin. And we had an airplane that should never been spun at all. It wasn't any good in the first place. And he put that thing in the spin down here between here and Rapid City with the power on. And he pointed that thing straight for the ground, and it just augured around there, and it was squeaking and covering, making rackets, and I thought we were finished up. Well, I finally got it out, and I said, now, if that's the kind of training you want me to give these students I've got up there, you might just well write it off, because I'm not going to give them that kind of flight training. You give them spins all right, but he didn't even know how to spin in the first place with the power on. I never had a ride like that in my life, and I still don't know why that airplane didn't come apart. Oh.
Do you think it was more fun to fly in the earlier days when you were flying than it might be now because of all the restrictions and because of the autopilot and all these things?
Oh, sure, that was flying. Now you're just part of the machinery. You sit in there, you don't really have to do much of anything. Howard brought me back from Rochester one time, and we was on instrument most of the way, and he just sat there and didn't hardly do a thing. If you get a ride with him, you'd be surprised how little he does. He's one of the kind, a lot of them work at it, but he's one of the kind that just let the airplane do the flying, and he rides along. He'd change a little button here and there and reach over and do something once in a while, but he don't have to work very hard at it. Of course, I never worked very hard flying the old type. You didn't have to, but some of them were just sitting there working their head off with the controls when they didn't need to. I rode with one guy. I'd never flown that well. It was while I was flying the Ford, and I didn't fly any of the little airplanes for 3 or 4 years while I was flying that big one. Partly because about every other place you went, somebody had had a homemade airplane and was wild to get me to fly it, because they'd say, well, that guy flying that Ford was here, and that day he flew my airplane. Well, I didn't. I passed them up because a lot of them didn't look like they were too hot. And several of them, you'd read about them, and just a short time after we'd leave there, they cracked up, and 2 or 3 of them were killed because they didn't have the thing built right. I just stayed in the Ford. Well, I rode with this guy. We had a line, Rapid Airlines moved to Omaha and had a big layout there, going to have an airport in every town of 5,000 people in the United States. That was some of the air castles they built down in the basement of the bank at Rapid City at the meetings. Anyway, he'd just sit there, and this airplane had a little short stick. You could just leave your hand laying on your elbow or wrist laying on your knee and just fly there, a little short stick. And he was just working that stick. It was a nice day, just like today. And he was working that thing all the time, and he wanted to know if we got about halfway down there, and he wanted to know if I wanted to fly. And I said, gosh, I don't know whether I can juggle this thing or not. And he said, yeah, go ahead, it flies nice. And I just laid my hand over on the stick. He didn't have to move it. I done most of it with the rudder. A good airplane and decent air, you can fly it with the ailerons or the rudder alone. You don't have to use them both. And decent air, you don't have to move them hardly at all. And I just laid my hand over there and flew on to St. Louis. And when we got back to Omaha, I heard him in the office telling the guys, that's the laziest guy I ever saw. He never does a thing when he's flying. But you don't have to if you know how to fly and the airplane's any good.
So would you say that you were probably pretty happy that you were young when you were, so you could fly in the early days, or would you think it'd be interesting to be a young man now learning to fly?
Well, that's hard to figure out. It was a different thing to what it is now that I can't figure out yet how I got away without any training at all after all the training I've gave so many 100 guys, and they still didn't know how to fly. When I started in over here on the training program, we gave them 35 hours. We had to give them 10 hours solo. You couldn't solo them less than 8, but dual, before you could let them solo. But I got away with the second flight I ever made hauling a $5 passenger. I still can't figure out how I done it. But
what were the best planes you flew? I mean, you showed me a picture in there of a plane that you thought was as good as any you'd flown, and was better than most of the planes made since then. Or?
That Ford Trimotor, when that came out, was 20 years ahead of all the other airplanes. That's the nicest airplane to fly I was ever in. It didn't go so fast, but you could do things with it that they can't even talk about now.
Like what?
Oh, I could land right out here in the stubble field with it, take off, haul passengers or a pasture or grass sod field. I had the motors all quit one time in Mexico, and I landed about 45 degrees across a listed cornfield. You know how they plant corn with a lister? Leaves those ditches? Well, the guy tried to come up in front. I had one gas tank that was leaking, and I had the gas shut off, and he slipped. He had to step up about that far to get up in the pilot seat. He was going to ride up with me. He was a pilot. and he slipped off of that step there and tried to catch himself, and he turned that tank on. Well, the way the fuel lines were hooked up, when he opened that one that was empty, the gas siphoned across so fast that it didn't let down into the lines to the motors. And they all quit just when I was about 100 feet off the ground in that cornfield right ahead of me, and I couldn't do anything, only just landed there. And the wheels just bounced over those ridges, never heard a thing. We had an irrigation ditch there, and we built a bridge across it, had about 50 Mexicans pull it across there with ropes, and there was a little strip on the other side, and I just took off there and went back to the field, shut the gas off the way I done that, of course, before I took off. Went on carrying passengers, just like nothing had happened.
How about other planes that you especially liked, that you were fond of? Perhaps, I suppose, maybe that very first one you ever owned. What kind of an airplane was that?
The ones I traded?
That you got from, North Dakota.
Oh, that was a standard. That was a surplus that they'd built during the war for training. That was a good old, for wood and cloth, it was a good airplane for its time, but it was a little early for what they got nowadays. They didn't have that up like that thing. Wonder if it isn't just, oh, he's already landed. The
shuttle.
Yeah. I hope he made it. Nobody had a radio on, or?
Well, maybe we should go in the house and check.
Well,
sounds like a good place to end the conversation anyway. I want to thank you for talking to us, taking your time out today. We'll go in and check the space shuttle, and we've been talking to Clyde Ice, pioneer aviator in South Dakota, and still going strong here on his farm outside of Spearfish. I'm Tom Dillon for Statewide. Good evening.
We might be able to we will be able to get it at noon.
If your TV's working, maybe we can even get to see a little picture of it.
12 o'clock. Just time for the, you want to get my wires off. Yeah. Well, they're trying to write a book, but I don't think it'll work because I didn't commit any disasters or kill anybody or bloody anybody's nose. Everything I ever started out to do, I made a success of it. In flying, anyway. I just read that one Reader's Digest. The craziest doggone thing. And they write the most impossible things. This guy cranked up carrying the mail between, what is he